you very much, Maure. I appreciate that. Thank you, everyone, for being here. As has been mentioned, I'll be giving a talk which is going to sort of be a bit of a preview, let's say, of a book I'm working on, which is going to be on Lacanian theories and understandings of psychosis and autism. The way I've sort of planned the book and the talk likewise, although talk is obviously a much shorter format than a book, so we'll see how much of it we can get through, and I'm not planning on actually getting through all of it, but the parts that I want to get through I'll mention. So the book will have largely three parts, and these will be one part which is going to be explaining what kind of structural differences there are between psychosis and neurosis, but particularly what kind of negations have to occur in order for a so-called neurotic structure to be achieved. And that first part, which is going to be really focused on this idea of negation in psychoanalysis, is itself going to be divided into three parts. One part which will deal with the interpersonal, and the second part will deal with language, and the third part will deal with topology. Through these three perspectives, the interpersonal relations, the linguistic, and the topological, and I'll explain throughout what those three mean, particularly the less obvious one, the topological. We're going to get a sense of how for Lacan, for psychoanalysis, what occurs as a neurotic structure takes form. And by contrast to that, how non-neurotic structures, like psychotic structures, come about through slight differences within those structural moments. The second part will look at clinical entities within the non-neurotic or the psychotic structures. So these would be taking a closer look at autism, schizophrenia, and paranoia principally. In the book, I may also look at manic-depressive psychoses. I will also here talk about another category that we call ordinary psychosis, and I'll explain what that is as we get there. And in the final third part, I'll be looking at treatment. That part, how do we treat the psychoses? What are the differences? That third part, I will probably not get into today for considerations of time and just to be able to focus a little bit better on the other parts. So let's start with this part one, which is divided into three parts. And and part one, I've kind of tentatively for now called it of losses, lacks, and holes. So loss, lack, and whole, all these three terms point in the direction of a kind of negation. Loss, it's very clear, lack as well, and so is whole. And I'm going to be looking at this theme of negation through these three perspectives: interpersonal, linguistic, and topological. Now, when one does... Sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry.
Hello? Sorry, I couldn't hear very well. Was there a question? Okay.
No. I just said my speaker was on, so I was talking to someone.
Oh, I see. Okay, no problem. So now when one reads books of psychology or general psychoanalysis, what one sees that is focused upon are interpersonal relations, particularly in childhood. This is sort of universal in all the psych disciplines. What was the relation with the mother? How was the relation within toilet training? How was the relation of feeding the child, etc. And Lacan, like any other person interested in the mind, is going to focus to some extent on that. And a large part of his early work really focuses on that, but throughout. But as his thinking develops, as one gets to the later part of the early work, or it's still kind of within the early work, but what one sees very much highlighted as his thinking develops is the subject's relation not to other people, but to language itself. And that's a little bit more unique and specific to the Lacanian orientation. And then eventually in the later work, although seeds of it are found earlier on, one sees that he also kind of not gives up, but the emphasis is much less on the linguistic or the relation to language, and he starts developing these topological models. And so that's where I sort of speak of loss as sort of the type of negation that, marks the interpersonal relations, lack as the type of negation that Lacan sort of talks about within the linguistic model and holds when he gets into his topological. So let's start with the interpersonal. So this part A of part 1, which I call from symbolic, the interpersonal, 2 dots, from symbolic death to social coexistence. So again, death here is another reference to negation, again, to loss. And this has to do with the Oedipus complex. So probably most of you have heard about the Oedipus complex through knowledge that you may have of Freud, or perhaps you have knowledge of Lacan as well. And what Lacan does is he kind of rewrites the Oedipus complex in a certain way. And for him, the Oedipus complex, as opposed to the Freudian model, starts off with 3 people right away. Not 3 people, but 3 objects, if you will. The mother, the infant, but also an object, an imaginary object that Lacan calls the phallus, which is the object of the mother's desire. And this kind of imaginary object is an object that the child has some sense of and tries to emulate in order to get the mother's love and attention. The father intervenes in a second moment of the Oedipus complex to provide an interdiction, a prohibition, and this is the incest taboo. The incest taboo for Lacan states that the child does not need to become the object of the mother's desire. And so it's a kind of privation or a castration, forms of loss, forms of negation inflicted upon the mother and the child in the child's mind. So in the second moment of the Oedipus complex, the child faces some kind of a negation. In the third time, these are all sort of moments unraveling in the psyche of the child experiences the father no longer as a mere prohibitor, but as someone who gives something in return to what was prohibited in the second time, the time of the incest taboo. So now the child receives something from the father, a certain promise that if the incest taboo is respected, something will be gained later. So a big sort of philosophical question here comes about, in a sense, is how can this law be stated and accepted by the child, this law that forces, in a sense, a separation from the mother? How could it be elevated in such a way that the child can accept it? Because, of course, it's a type of a loss, right? And the way for this to happen is that the father's intervention has to somehow be perceived as not fulfilling necessarily and only a personal interest of the father for control or for whatever, but that it's essentially an act of love and perhaps even sacrifice on the father's part to intervene in this way. So the child has to harbor some sense that the father, in a sense, also submits to this law in a way. However, this is kind of difficult because the father isn't submitted to the same law. So when, to put it in a kind of anecdotal way, when a father or mother, when an authority figure in the family tells the child that he must go to sleep at 7:30, well, 7:30 is a very early time for the adults to go to sleep, and the child knows that they're not. And the child might be told that it's good for him to go to sleep earlier, that he must, etc. But there's an unevenness. There is a lack of reciprocity in a family institution. Family institution is not purely democratic, and it cannot be purely democratic, otherwise madness will ensue. But the child has to somehow take this leap of faith in a way that this kind of imbalance within the family structure is not an injustice, that there is nonetheless a fairness even in this fact. And most children don't like to go to sleep early. And the reason for that is because they feel excluded from something. And in fact, they are excluded from something because at the point at which the child goes to sleep, maybe the parents want to have a glass of wine, maybe they want to watch a film that would be inappropriate to watch with their child, or perhaps they just want to have sex. They certainly want to engage in something that they feel like they can do better when the child is away. And this sense of exclusion is very important in the Oedipus complex. The Oedipus complex points to a certain sense of loss, a certain sense of exclusion, a certain kind of accepting the inflicting of a certain prohibition. The child is told to separate from the mother, to sleep in his own bed, etc. But the mother and father get to sleep together. The child is told to stop playing doctor and do silly little perversities with his friends or her friends, but the parents are playing doctor on their own in the bedroom. So there is a certain unfairness, and and this is structural. And the reason for it is that the mother finds in the father, the adults find in each other something of interest that they cannot get from the child. This is a huge narcissistic blow to a child who might go through a phase of thinking he or she is the center of the parent's universe, but at some point comes to realize that there is an essential need that the parents have as adults that a child cannot by any means satisfy. And so you may be the apple of your mother's eye or whatever, but when it comes to the mother's feminine desires, sexual desires, etc., the child is impotent in that respect. And that's where the father comes in, let's say. So there's a constitutive unfairness, but it's an unfairness that has to be accepted. Battling against this unfairness leads to a kind of madness. So in a sense, mental health, or however one wants to call it, begins with this kind of negation that needs to be internalized, accepted within the family. Something is felt to be lost, but the more integrated that loss is, the better the child is able, with the help of the parents, to accept that loss, the better will the child gain something in return. And this is central to all of psychoanalytic thinking. There is always some essential experience of loss as a condition of a form of mental health. Lacan calls this loss castration. Sometimes he uses words like privation. Melanie Klein speaks of a depressive position, which is the position of mourning, of a kind of sense of loss that leads to mourning and pining and so on. And that is again consequent upon this narcissistic blow that one is not what one thought one is, meaning the center of the universe. It's a little bit like the child goes through what humanity had to go through. We thought we're the center of the universe, then only to find out that we're just another rock in the middle of space. We thought we're the greatest of the creatures, and we found out we're just another animal amongst the others. Then we thought that we are in control of our own minds, and Freud said, no, we have an unconscious that really dictates everything. And now we have AI that's, better than us at virtually anything we used to be very proud of. So we see this kind of, narcissistic blow to humanity, but what characterizes the normal development of a child is the ability to accept this type of narcissistic blow, this type of negation as a condition of normality. Another way to conceptualize this in terms of these interpersonal relations is through two processes. It's very important. There's two processes, which we will call alienation on the one side and separation on the other. Alienation requires the ability to recognize the mother's absence and register the idea that she may be interested in something else, meaning that she's lacking in something, and that makes her look for something to fulfill that, and that the child somehow isn't capable of fulfilling that because she's going elsewhere. So there's this moment of, wait a minute, she used to tell me I'm the apple of her eye and this and that, and constantly enjoying holding me, etc. But then there's this sense that her mind is somewhere else. And this is a first little trauma, not so little, in fact, it's a first big trauma, alienation. And the leftovers, the aftershocks of it are present in everyday life. You're sitting with your friend or your partner having dinner, and all of a sudden she picks up her phone, or he does, and just does and starts doing this, and so on. Oh, what does it do to you? Boom, triggers the idea, you're not the center of that person's desire. It causes anger sometimes, jealousy. Who were you talking to? Who was that? Etc. It's this fundamental structural constitutive trauma, which we call alienation, which is the realization that the other's desire, the other being the parents, is not solely directed towards us. There's this other realm from which we are incapable of addressing. That's alienation. And it creates a first division between self and other. Through it, it's a trauma, it's painful, but many things are achieved. The child realizes that he and the mother are separate. They're not one and the same. A kind of minimal first distinction occurs, a sort of first moment of pure difference. In the second moment, called separation, separation involves how does the child interpret these absences? The absences of the mother all of a sudden open a whole realm of meaning because they cause a question. Where did she go? And this questioning can, of course, lead to a lot of pain, depending on the family situation. Now, in the moment of separation, the child realizes in some way that the mother leaves because she has a desire for something else, namely the father, something like that. So in the moment of alienation, the one becomes two. There's a separation or a division, let's say a difference. And in the moment that we call separation, there's already a certain separation and alienation, but what we strictly speaking call separation, the two becomes three. There is a sense that, okay, the mother leaves because her desire points to something else. And this is quite important, these two moments, and I'll get back to it later, because they give us a fundamental distinction within the categories of psychosis. And I'll get back to that when we talk about the various clinical entities. But for now, what is important to keep in mind is for the achievement of a neurotic structure, both of these two moments have to occur as part and parcel of the Oedipal situation. The mother is sometimes not there because her desire took her elsewhere. You know, in other forms of psychoanalysis, it's thought of differently. It's not thought that it's not thought that the child interprets the mother's absence in terms of her desire, but it's thought that, oh, mother leaves me because I was cruel to her, or I was a bad boy, or a bad girl, or whatever. But for Lacan, it's very crucial that the mother's absence brings about a question regarding the mother's desire. What does she want that the child does not have? And this is, I think, a crucial point from the Lacanian model. So, and then in the moment of separation, oh, she goes there because there's something that the child doesn't have that another adult has, however. It has something to do maybe with adulthood. It has something to do with a certain power, certain ability, a certain knowledge that is barred of children or something like that. And so these are this alienation and separation, again, another way to conceptualize the losses that are inherent to these early interpersonal relations within the family that lead to a neurotic structure. In a sense, what one sees here is that you know, and another way of conceptualizing all of this, rather than through the Oedipal myth, and this was provided by Freud, is through the myth of the primal horde, which again involves the idea of sacrifice in this case, which is again the idea of a certain type of loss. Now, we know from René Girard, a French anthropologist, on his work on the sacred, that sacrifice, rituals of sacrifice, were a means of containing violence. They were an act of violence in order to contain violence. So a scapegoat would be found, would be sacrificed in order to appease the rage and violence of people in the community. An innocent scapegoat was found, declared guilty, and then killed, and this would contain violence. It would put people in some sense at rest. This was the the model that René Girard put forward, and thinkers like Slavoj Žižek pick up on it as well. It's violence is a means of containing violence. And a similar kind of idea can be found in Freud in Totem and Taboo, where he talks about the notion of the primal horde, which Lacan takes up and considers one of the great or the last myth provided by modernity. Freud, it's ambiguous. He's presenting it as a historical fact rather than a myth. We're going to look at it more mythologically, but it's the logic of the story that really matters. The idea is that there is a horde with a primal father who has all the power, and all the women are at his disposal, and his sons are completely castrated in relation to him. They have no rights, and he has all the rights and all the enjoyment. It's the myth of a purely enjoying subject with absolute power, like a kind of a dictator. Eventually, what happens is, according to Freud's story, is that the brothers unite and come together and kill the father in order for themselves to have the type of power that the father had. But once they kill the father, they start to feel guilt for having killed him because somehow they loved him in some way also. And then they feel guilt, and that leads to their decision that henceforth nobody should be as powerful as the father ever was, and that a table of laws should be put forward to regulate peaceful social coexistence among the surviving members of the horde. So it's basically a myth about how relations of power eventually give way to law and social contract through a kind of sacrifice. And a certain social institutions are put in place. A taboo on incest is put in place. Regulations about who can marry who are put in place. Murder is then forbidden, etc. So a fraternal alliance is put into place so that the community can live peacefully together. That murder would henceforth be forbidden, as would be incest, and exogamy, the demand that people marry outside of the clan, would be also put forward. Now, this, again, is another story about loss. First, the loss of the idea of one subject that can enjoy so much. That idea killed. It's about the loss of being able to occupy that place again, and instead of this pure enjoyment embodied by this primal father, we have a tablet of laws that prohibits a bunch of things, that makes a number of things illegal, forbidden. Again, it's another story where through negation, through interdiction, through law and through loss, peace and normality and social coexistence and sanity are brought about. So what we see, if we go back to the to go back to the Oedipus complex that we spoke about earlier, is that the father proclaims an interdiction. You cannot be the object of the mother's desire. But what I had mentioned, that at some point the child has to understand that this is not a pure interdiction. It liberates the child in a way. A child that is stuck with the idea of the possibility of incest is not a liberated child. It's in fact a child that is much more imprisoned within the incestuous rapport. So what happens in the completion of the Oedipus complex, a little bit like with the story of Totem and Taboo, what eventually happens is that the child comes to recognize that the incestuous relation is not only forbidden, but it's an impossible relation. That success, quote unquote, or triumph is the preferred word by psychoanalysts, within the Oedipal situation is impossible, because that triumph itself becomes worse than any defeat. And this we see clinically. People who suffer from what we call Oedipal triumph, maybe they have one parent die very young, or something where they are kind of put in the position of a kind of symbolic partner to the remaining parent. They get caught up in a kind of, not literally incestuous relation, but emotionally incestuous relation, where they're very, very bound up, and that kind of inhibits the possibility for growth, social integration, finding a suitable partner later in life, etc., for that person. So there's this idea that the incest taboo is not strictly forbidding something that you otherwise could have, but it's forbidding something that is anyways impossible, that is anyways undesirable. And this is, in a sense, what the Totem and Taboo story of the primal horde is doing as well. After they kill the father, instead of being liberated and enjoying this wild sexuality, they realize that they feel guilty, that all of this was terrible, that it was terrible that the father had so much power, it was terrible that they had to kill him, that it's terrible now that they're burdened by guilt. And instead of freedom, they are now burdened with the responsibility to create a tablet of laws. Social institutions of exogamy have to be maintained, and the regulation of marriage ties and the limiting of sexuality, etc., so that a catastrophe like this doesn't happen again. So what we see both through the Totem and Taboo and through the Oedipus, we see that a certain idea of impossibility has to be understood by the subject. That total enjoyment, absolute freedom, a life without negation is an impossibility. It's not just, it's possible, but it's better you don't do it because it's unfair to others. No, that life is impossible. What will happen is that you will be struck down by castration, as the Lacanians call it, in a more virulent way, like the father who was murdered. And of course, this often one sees people who exercise huge amount of despotic power. Either their life ends with being killed, or even if it doesn't, they live a life of paranoia and anxiety. I'm not saying this for us to have any compassion for such people, but it's to show that there is something intrinsically impossible about the idea of absolute enjoyment, that a life without negation is, in a sense, not really much of a life. So what needs to happen, basically, is a kind of internalization of authority. And for this authority to be accepted, the figure of authority, whether it's the mother or the father, has to exercise a kind of force and love at the same time. That's in a way, one way we could define authority. Authority is not pure force, it's not tyranny, but authority is also not just pure love and, oh, you can do whatever you like. It's very important within the family institution for the child to go through a phase of feeling unconditionally loved. Of course, it's very important for a child to experience that. But it's also important that at some point the child experiences that the love is conditional upon the integration and internalization of some authority. That for the love to persist, you have to go to bed at a certain time. For the love to persist, you have to try to do well at school, that you respect your elders, or whatever. That experience of a love that is conditional, meaning a love that carries within it a kind of negation, is extremely important for the well-being of the subject. Now, how does that happen? Well, we know that two extremes will not lead it to happen. Extremely permissive parenting will likely not lead to the ability to internalize the ability to internalize authority. But overly severe and brutal tyrannical parenting won't either, because the child will see no love there. The child has to come to this understanding of a particular dialectic, that you give up something and then you gain something. You go to bed early, tomorrow morning it feels good. You study, at the end of the year, you get a happy report card and you enjoy the summer. You do that, you go to university, I don't know, whatever, and so on. That there's this dialectic. In these two forms of extreme parenting, the overly permissive or the overly tyrannical, the child will not have the experience of this dialectic, which is very, very important for the internalization of authority. So in a sense, authority is this paradoxical unity of something like force and love. I say force because, you know, if we tell a child, look, it's time to go to bed, sometimes, and the child says, why? Sometimes it's just, that's just the way it is. You know, we can maybe explain it, but maybe we don't even have to explain it. I mean, the whole idea of authority is that it doesn't need to explain itself. If it needs to explain itself, it's not authority. And I think that if the child can come to some understanding that, okay, at least in some cases, whatever daddy or mommy say, I just accept, and that will be good, you know. And in his teenage years or her teenage years, that questioning can then happen, right? But if there is some acceptance that some things are just, don't even argue about it, and just enjoy the benefit that comes from accepting and internalizing that authority, things can work out. And this is, of course, true in Hegel's model as well. Hegel's thinking really includes the category of authority very much. He in a way was even for punishment, which is maybe a little bit extreme, but he says that punishment, I quote him, lifts the universal into their consciousness and will. It's kind of a funny way to put it, lifts the universal. But in a sense, the idea of authority is to implement in the child some idea of what is best for the universal good. So this is these types of losses that are very important. Now, concomitant with this loss at the level of the subject, him or herself, the loss of this union with the mother, let's say, or the loss of being the center of the parent's world, the loss of a sense of unconditional love, etc. Concomitant with that, the child who accepts these is paradoxically able, I shouldn't even say paradoxically, is able by that very fact of accepting this narcissistic blow of equally limiting the power of the parents. A child who doesn't integrate authority at all and lives in a world that is without authority ends up living in a world where the rule of force is the law, where force and power are law. And it's a very paranoid world. It's the world of gangsters, it's the world of criminals, it's the world of suffering. It's a world where you either survive or you die. But the world that we live in, and in order to have peaceful social coexistence, something has to curtail the rule of force. And that's something like law. Now, a child who accepts authority and internalizes it is, by that very means, capable of, in turn, castrating his parents or her parents, meaning of limiting their power over him or her. A child who totally rejects parental authority, either because it didn't exist or it was too harsh, it was too permissive or too tyrannical, and there was no way of being able to accept it in a proper way, that child is paradoxically going to be all the more passive and subdued by that parental authority. So integrating, accepting this negation allows one to exercise it and limit the power of others over oneself. And this is where fantasies of murdering or parasital fantasies, the fantasies of killing the parents, come in. There are, of course, unconscious fantasies, but they play a big role in psychoanalysis. The ability to have a fantasy of murdering the parents, and children do like to play with the idea of killing, shooting, things like that. Those fantasies are important because their function is to not kill the parent itself, but to kill the incestuous relationship with the parent. And so where parasital fantasies don't exist, the Oedipus complex, and it's all of the fantasies that come with the Oedipus complex, and these are fantasies of being seduced by the parents, fantasies of being castrated by the parents, etc. All of these fantasies play out without end. And this is what we see in the psychoses, is that the fundamental fantasies of the Oedipus complex, which are the seduction fantasy, the fantasy of being beaten, the castration fantasy, etc., these fantasies just play out without end. Now, any subject can, on a bad day, let's say you're driving and you keep getting honked at, or you're driving, you're speeding, and a policeman stops you and kind of yells at you. He's a bit rude to you, but you have to kind of obey. Now it can trigger in your mind, and you may have anxiety the rest of the day because it's triggered in your mind some unconscious beating fantasies from the father or mother or something like that. But within a let's say somewhat healthy psychic structure, those fantasies can be kind of brought to an end. In a person who suffers from greater or more unresolved psychic conflicts may carry the anxiety of that encounter with that police officer for days or weeks or months and be constantly steaming up internally. It's the virtue of being able to integrate authority and loss and negation in those early relationships is it allows, in turn, to be able to castrate, at least within the level of the psyche, the power of the authoritative other. So, okay, police stops me, yells at me a bit, treats me a bit like a naughty child. It's a bit humiliating. It's obviously annoying, etc. But, after an hour or so, I get to work and I can just kind of forget about it, right? That's because there is at work, at the unconscious level, a parasital fantasy, an ability that I can put an end to that fantasy through a kind of symbolic, very, very, very important, a symbolic fantasy murder. In the psychoses, what we sometimes see is this parasital fantasy isn't there. And that's precisely to the extent to which the integration of authority hasn't occurred, and hence the power to also limit the authority isn't there, and hence the authority becomes wildly powerful, so powerful that it can't even call it an authority, but really it's almost like a predator. And for some people, the police or any law figure or a judge or school teacher even can really take on a predatorial signification. So what we see here that needs to happen in this I've often talked about this integration of authority. It's basically an act of faith that happens at the tail end of the Oedipus complex. And this is very, very important, this moment of an act of faith, because it's that says, okay, I will give this up. I will give that up. I will go to bed at this hour. I will let mommy and daddy go on their vacation by themselves, and I'll stay with my grandparents and be excluded from that. Fine. I have an act of faith that this is somehow for my own good. Now, if the parents are constantly doing that stuff, every weekend, nightclub, babysitter, etc., child says, I don't believe it anymore, and then authority can't be. Authority requires that the parents exercise it responsibly so that the child can integrate it, accept it through an act of faith. One can only believe in something that is essentially believable. It's very, very hard to believe in the good exercise of authority of selfish parents who just want to party all the time and leave the child with complete strangers every weekend. But if the exercise of authority is done in good faith, putting the child to bed at a reasonable hour so that the child gets the required amount of sleep for its brain development, or so that the next day she is capable of performing well at school so that he can, progress in his education and now whatever, the child can believe it. Yes, my parents did these things because they love me. I mean, some people even look back at sometimes some corporal punishment of their parents with a kind of nice feeling, because they feel like, well, maybe it was a bit harsh to do it that way, but they believe that there was a kind of goodwill on the parents. And that's very important, is that an act of faith takes place. The family institution has to be such, it has to be good enough. It doesn't have to be great. It has to just be good enough to enable the act of faith by which a child will be willing to give up certain things. And this is crucial, this category of faith. And, it's no coincidence that the idea of the father has been traditionally a kind of almost religious category. God, the father. To believe in the father, what means what a father? It means an authority figure who exercises authority, not for his own enjoyment, but for the well-being of the family. That is something that needs to be believed in. It's not a given. It's not a given that, somebody's going to be that way. Because, this father, this particular person who's playing that role might be selfish sometimes, and definitely will be sometimes, and might sometimes just want the child to go to sleep so that he can, just get a few extra hours of rest before he himself goes to sleep. Or there'll be that, and that's okay. And that's why all it takes is a good enough. And in most cases where that act of faith is taken, there may be a lot of disbelief alongside that act of faith, but nevertheless, that leap of faith is taken. But in some cases, what we call the non-neurotic structures, that leap of faith isn't taken. A fundamental distinguishing factor between the psychoses and the neuroses is the fundamental absence of an act of faith in relation to the goodwill of authority and law. And that's why, often psychotics become extremely gifted critical thinkers, because they are not intuitively prone towards taking these acts of faith. You see some, if you go into a classroom, I don't know, kindergarten, most of the children believe in Santa Claus, but there'll be the one or two who find it a laughable idea, right? And they would be the psychotic ones who just can't believe in this ridiculous idea of somebody going around giving gifts and so on. So what we call this father that needs to be believed in, at least minimally believed in, we call it the symbolic father. It's not a person that really exists, because all that exists is an actual father who plays a certain role. And to the extent that he can play that role, in a good enough fashion, some kind of belief in a symbolic father comes about. And the symbolic father does a number of things. He institutes an incest taboo. So I'm just kind of summarizing what we said. So he institutes an incest taboo, and does so for the sake of the well-being of the child, to enable him or her to have a separate existence from the parents and create an identity and place for him or herself in the social bond. He, through this incest taboo, protects the child from the perversity of adult sexuality. Children who've internalized authority are more likely to protest if they are in a situation of possible sexual abuse by an adult. Psychotic children who haven't internalized authority are more prone to not protest against that. So it has a huge protective function, this incest taboo. It's a way of telling the child, anything that smells of this adult stuff, you run away. It shouldn't be part of your life at the age of 6, 7, 8 years old, and certainly not with an adult. If you're playing doctor with your friends, that's one thing. But if one of your teachers comes in and there's this generational gap, because that's what authority makes one understand, that there is a generational difference that is very, very, very important to abide by. So this symbolic father allows the child to be protected from the perversity of adults. It also allows for the idea of the most powerful person, like we saw in the primal horde, to be kept empty. It makes it clear to the child that a proper social institution, a proper community might have a leader, it might have a person in a place of authority, but there should be checks and balances to make sure that that authority and power are not abused. The symbolic father makes it possible for the child to realize that total enjoyment is not only forbidden, but it's actually impossible and not desirable. People who have a good enough psychic structure know that, doing nothing all night and day except for partying and having fun and just doing whatever you want at any time is not only not allowed, let's say, or not possible because we're financially restricted, it's that it's not even desirable, even if you had the means to do it. So the position of the most powerful is kept empty. The notion of impossibility, this impossibility of total enjoyment is brought about. And the possibility of questioning things is brought about. An authority that we can properly internalize, we can then later in life question its validity, and decide how we, if we choose to be parents, want to do that. Exercise our own authority in raising a child or raising children. So the idea is always something gained through a loss, something lost and then something gained. This kind of dialectic, if it can be experienced by the child will accept this authority, and there will be a symbolic father. Sexual difference is understood, generational difference is understood through it, and the difference of power between those who have power and those who don't have power, and all of these kinds of central differences that regulate our social world will be understood by the child. The possibility of shame will be brought about. This is a very important point. Shame is a way that we protect ourselves against the perversity of the other. So if I don't know, you're on a date with somebody and you haven't met them before, it's online, then they behave in a way that makes you embarrassed, that makes you a bit uncomfortable, and you feel yourself blushing a lot. This is a signal there is a little bit of a perversity in this person that I'm not very comfortable with. Maybe on the first date, certain types of jokes are less appropriate, and this person is making them, let's say, and there's a moment of shame. Or you have your parents have some guests over, your child, and there's one of the men there who are making comments to the children that are just a little bit weird, and it makes the child feel a little bit awkward. So shame, the possibility of feeling shame, protects one from the perversity of the other, and protects one from behaving perversely as well. The reason I don't behave perversely in social situations is because I don't want to embarrass myself. Shame is a very great regulator of our own behavior and a great signal for the behavior of others. This internalization of authority through these losses that we spoke about make this a possibility. And this what we see in children is that children at the age of 2 or 3 have no shame at their nudity. They run around, they're perfectly happy to do so in the nude in front of people. But at a certain point, boom, all of a sudden they have a notion that some parts of the body are private. There are private parts. And those parts nobody should see, not even their parents. And that's they have to take a shower on their own. Whereas when they're 2 or 3, they're perfectly happy to be brought to the toilet by whoever they've made a little bit of a bond with, etc. But at a certain point, as this internalization of authority occurs, shame comes about, and it's a shame that does protect the integrity of the body. And it's, captured very well by a painting by Masaccio. It's a very beautiful painting where they're in Eden, and Adam and Eve have taken a bite of the apple, and God comes back, and God right away knows that they've taken a bite of the apple. And the reason he knows is because as soon as he comes back, Adam does this, and Eve goes like this. And it's because she exhibits shame at her nudity, and he exhibits shame at having enjoyed looking at her nude. And it's this recognition of shame that betrays that they now have a certain knowledge. It's an extremely beautiful story to explain how this castration occurs, how through this kind of fall, the human being's relation to the body changes. And then we see that with children. There's a point at which they're just enjoying the nudity. And then all of a sudden, that relation of freedom to the nude body changes to a relation of shame. So another kind of a loss, but it's a loss that is very regulative and important and these are some of the impasses of the ideas of total sexual liberation, etc. So I'm now going to go on to the language part. This was interpersonal, let's say. The language part is going to be very much tied into that, but with a specific focus on things like name and language, etc. But before I do that, maybe we can take a few minutes for some questions if there are any. Any questions?
I have a question. I'm sorry, can you hear me now? I'm having trouble to understand the impossibility of the total enjoyment by means of the non-neurotic structure, like how it impacts how it interferes with the non-neurotic structure. Can you say more words on that?
So in the what you see in the neurotic structure is some form of realization at the unconscious level, at least, that total enjoyment cannot exist. And hence, the subject may fantasize about it, may think about it, may dream about it, but will probably not act in pursuit of it. But what you might see in perverse structure or in psychotic structure is a deliberate attempt to seek it, either by trying to, become a despotic leader of a country, or by having, extreme behaviors, related either to drug use or promiscuities of extreme types. And of course, it can exist in neurosis too. It's the main point is that for the sort of normalization of the mind, in a way, the idea that total enjoyment is not only forbidden, but that it's structurally impossible, One good example is this about impossibility is let's say a person comes from a very from a country that is very limiting in personal freedoms. You can't drink, you can't do this, you can't do that, whatever. In comparison to a liberal society where at least daily personal freedoms are granted to quite an extent. The person who lives in the more repressive regime is more likely to harbor the idea that had it not been for these restrictions, I would have had this great time. The person who lives in the liberal society knows that, well, he or she has all these freedoms and still, unhappiness in some sense is a structural fact of being human. Now, it's not exactly what I was talking about, but it's a way of showing the difference between a conception of the origin of the human inability to be fully satisfied. That's what it's really about, is that as humans, it is impossible to achieve any kind of full satisfaction. But in some cases, we might fall prey to that illusion, and in some cases, we might not. And the aim of the full completion of the Oedipus situation is to some extent, and of course, the fantasy of that full enjoyment, it persists in all of us. And that's why every human, neurotic or otherwise, is very fascinated by the figure of a person who has full enjoyment. Sometimes we vote for political leaders, not because we like their policies, etc., but because they exhibit this aura that, oh, I can fully enjoy and so will you. And this shows that in all of us, there is this nostalgia for the idea of full enjoyment. The uncastrated person who has no limitation is extremely seductive for humans. And in order not to be seduced by it, in order to be able to resist that, we need to come to the idea that what this person exhibits or tries to show, it's a lie. It's a full enjoyment is impossible, not just simply forbidden by this particular situation, social situation, and possible in another one. It's something like that. Any other questions or a follow-up to that?
Follow-up, quick, but then I'm going to keep it very brief. But it's not only impossible, you also suggest that it has to be insinuated by this father as undesirable, this total enjoyment, this psychotic father. So it's just kind of like its own tale, because while the authority suggests that it's not only impossible, it's also undesirable, because once you desire it, then you gain, then I may be castrated, even if though I is good and amazing symbol. But on the other hand, that it's a total enjoyment becomes a kind of like negative connotation in the mind, when it's supposed to be a kind of like a positive.
It's not positive. I mean, your voice cut out a lot. I think the internet connection is in there. But if I've understood, I don't know. It has no positive connotation psychoanalytically. It has a positive connotation colloquially because it's a very seductive idea, the idea that total enjoyment is possible. And one of the responsibilities of authority is to help somebody see that, somebody meaning a child, that you can stay up until 2 a.m. and not go to school and etc. But this is not gonna, you're not gonna enjoy that. In the long run, it's going to lead to despair, regret. It's not going to, it's fool's gold, basically. It will not render what was promised. Just like the story of the primal horde, which was a story of the brothers murdering the father, they thought that they're going to have this total enjoyment afterwards. But then they got guilt. It was this very unhappy consciousness ensued. They were they were like burdened by guilt, social responsibility, and the need to create rules and tablets to regulate social relations so that this doesn't happen again. It's basically a story of impossibility. Yeah. I'm sorry, somehow your voice cut out a lot, so I may have not been able to, I have a feeling that I may not have heard very well. Any other questions?
Hi. Thank you very much. Great presentation. I just want to add for your ideas that the rulers, they have the power and the authority, and only they can have this enjoyment. I mean, they are fully in corruption. They are fully doing everything like Arab states, some states, yes. They are fully in enjoyment, and others are not. But still, people likes them.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, and another thing, the earthquake happened in Turkey. Yeah, earthquakes and these things brings also the sense of the father, the helper, the God who will help. Yes, and the ruler in that time, in these cases, also as per meat in our language, in our big other, yes, also is a how to say indicator. Yes, earthquakes happen in Turkey, and after that, in that region, there was a lot of problems, but 60% people voted for the Erdogan, for example, in Turkey. Yeah, as a father, as a ruler, as father, yes.
Yes.
Maybe symbolic father.
It's a very universal human phenomenon because because these losses are a condition of sanity in a sense, and we go through these losses, it leaves a nostalgia. It leaves this idea of, oh, and so people who show, I haven't lost it. I still, I have 6 Ferraris and 20 wives and billions of dollars and etc. People who exhibit that look, who play this game of showing that, oh, they have this total enjoyment, they are extremely attractive to other people. Extremely. It's one of the dangers. And I think that a very important reason for being educated is not to fall prey to this seduction. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There is an incredible attraction to people who are uncastrated, is what we say. Military leaders, dictators, etc.
Yeah, and also Pompeii, that was in 70s, the earthquake, the volcano. It also brings the power of Christianity to widespread in Rome. Yeah, I mean, people start, there is one God who is powerful. Before there was many gods, but new God is coming. And this gave also sense of the big other, the symbolic otherness.
Yeah.
Yeah, to widespread of Christianity. It was one of the reasons. Not main, but maybe one of the reasons.
It's an interesting point. Interesting. I mean, well, one of the things with Christianity is that, in a way, it's, if you look at the Greek gods and then you look eventually at the God becomes more and more dead. At the end, it's just this. Christianity is a religion of atheism, really. They crucify God. and God becomes just an abstract concept. You know, you could say that you know what we've seen in the centuries is a becoming concept of God, and it's a bit like the murder of the primal father, right? It's to you know, but the Greek gods, they were gods of enjoyment, sexual and rivalry, and they're fighting, and
Yes.
and the
Coming
like that. Yeah.
like Zoroaster's Ahura Mazda.
Yeah, right. Interesting. That's very interesting. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. Any other questions?
There's a question in the chat from Simon, if you'd like to read it.
Sure. Let me
Right.
get here. Okay. What is the role of the father in relation to the child who becomes the object of the mother? Which branch? Well, you know, yeah, thank you for that. It's very hard to know, you know, there's no simple answer, and it really depends to what extent. But a child who is strictly the object of the mother, every child begins life that way. It's part of, you know, being loved and feeling special, etc. But if that negation that we've been talking about, that loss doesn't happen at all, if the father's role is completely closed in being able to separate, or if the mother herself doesn't allow the child to separate, then there's a certain chance for the child to become psychotic. Now, you cannot predict anything. But psychosis occurs precisely to the extent to which the child cannot find a way to be something other than the mother's object, the phallus of the mother, like Lacan says it. You know, there's a funny thing that I read some years ago, which I thought was quite interesting. A French psychoanalyst, Gérard Pommier, was explaining that why is it important to give children gifts? You know, and I thought that's an interesting question, because it's true. In all cultures, generally, children are, well, maybe not all cultures, but it's a very common practice to give children gifts. It could be small gifts, big gifts, whatever. And he was saying that it's very, very important for a child to receive gifts. And I thought that's interesting. And I couldn't really understand why. And then he explained it very brilliantly. He said, when you give a child a gift, you are giving them this unconscious message. You're saying, I'm giving you a gift because you yourself are not a gift. So by giving a child a gift, you're telling them it's your duty to enjoy a gift, not to be enjoyed as a gift. And this is the way, this is the message that a child needs to get, either through gifts or however. The child needs to receive the message that you are someone in your own right. You're not here for me to enjoy you. Me to, you know, you're not here just for us to have a good laugh or to find you cute or whatever, and that's part of it, fine. But you're essentially here to express yourself, to have ideas, to speak, to get upset about some things, to like some things, dislike other things, within, of course, a certain frame, and to enjoy things, not to be enjoyed by people. And a gift is an instance of that. And that's the idea of this separation. You're not a gift. That's the narcissistic blow. But in compensation to that narcissistic blow, you can enjoy gifts. People who continue with the idea that they are a gift, it could get very, very, very scary. They might, you know, let themselves be exploited. A gift is something exploited. A gift is enjoyed. And then as soon as one is bored of it, one throws it away. Think of all the gifts that you receive that are in your basement that you don't care about anymore. A gift is something to be consumed and forgotten. This is not a position for a human subject to occupy. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Oh, okay.
Okay. I didn't understand if you could go back over the connection between internalizing authority and acceptance of the justice of the father. Because it sounded fine to me until you mentioned the comparison of a liberal and, say, a tyrannical society, because I was thinking of the opposite example. Where a liberal society you could imagine without having any parents, or in the tyrannical society you can imagine this means that you mentioned where you imagine killing, and that allows. I thought that was kind of a pivot into internalizing authority. So, can you internalize authority by going through that process of imagining yourself killing the tyrant because you live in a tyrannical society?
Mhm.
You don't have to believe in the justice of the tyrant to be able to make that step. Does that make any sense? I was thinking the opposite direction. A liberal society where perhaps you have no parents. You could fall into the psychotic.
Yeah.
But that's sort of.
Yeah, so I think let me know if this will help. I think I see where you're coming from. What I was sort of saying is that because I sort of defined authority as requiring some force, but also some love, because of defining it that way, I think any of the two poles of total force without love or love without any force as inhibiting the internalization of authority. So, as you said, in an overly liberal, permissive family situation where the child is allowed to do whatever, without any frame, without any schedule, without any limits, that can be a problem. But also one where the child feels that any demand made upon him is strictly for the selfish aims of the parents. That's also a problem. So if the parents are like, oh, go clean up the kitchen, or do this, do that, all the time, but there's no sense that this is for the child. There's just this constant, repetitive, obvious fact to the child that the parents are just doing this for themselves. They want me to sleep so they could party. They want me to be quiet and spend the weekend with this babysitter, I don't know, so they could go wherever, etc. And if there's this, so that's now, but this I think was clear to you. Your question had something to do with the parasital fantasy. Am I right? Is that?
Well, no, it just seemed to me that to accept the justice of this deprivation, that some sort of loss leads to something that is positive, right? Has to be accepted. Well, it seemed to be that the myth, if we suggest it as a myth, whatever the father has to say is a myth, let's say, okay, for whatever reason, does it have to be believed? Let's say we don't believe the myth of the father, but we can internalize authority by imagining ourselves killing him. We don't have to fall in. It didn't seem that it requires us falling into that path of the psychotic that doesn't believe in authority at all. I think of, an Arab state was mentioned earlier, so you could take, certain kinds of Arab states and other kinds of Arab states, which you could put on both ends of a spectrum and look at them differently. We take Syria, where there's a civil war. There's a lot of people who believe in the dictator, that he's doing something good, and that you could take, countries which are much richer than the Gulf, perhaps, and maybe you could find that more difficult for people to believe. But the point is that you don't have to believe in the justice of the myth to go through that step that I thought you had.
Maybe
described.
Yeah, that's a good point. I should probably restate that maybe this way is it's not that the child has to necessarily think that everything the father does is just, but that through the good enough goodwill of the parents, the child can achieve a certain sense of measure in his or her own mind of what something just is, of what something like so sometimes you see, like, for example, you see in the lives of some psychotic people is that clinically you see it. You have a psychotic person who's coming for therapy or whatever, and then after years of therapy with you, they mention in passing the repeated times in their adolescence that they were sexually assaulted by children, other children, older children, or whatever, or by a relative. It just happens in passing. And this lack of measure to realize that you've been in therapy for all these years, and this is a parenthetical remark, right? This is like the idea is not to to come to terms with the idea that this is a just thing, right? It's just to somehow through the Oedipal situation to come to some understanding of, and that understanding will differ for different neurotic subjects, but some sense of beyond a certain point of being treated a certain way, it's no longer human. And I'm going to say no. That ability to have had a good enough experience of the parents to know that there's a certain limit, So a neurotic child might get yelled at school by his teacher and say, whatever, and dislike it or whatever. But okay, at school, teachers can yell. But if the teacher sexually makes an advance, they will know that this is not right. I think that's kind of what I meant by the internalization of authority, and to come to, maybe I shouldn't have said to consider it just, not that was maybe badly put, but to come to a sense that there is some things that fall under the side of it's okay, fine, but some exercises of authority fall outside of that. And if my school teacher or whoever, uncle or I don't know, whatever, does a certain thing to me that is perverse, I will know where that falls. But sometimes in psychosis, you see, because of the lack of the registering of these boundaries, because boundaries always require authority. There's no such thing as the recognition of a boundary outside the experience of an authority that establishes your consciousness of those boundaries. And sometimes you see in psychosis people who might have been abused quite a bit, and they can't even formulate a protest against it. Something like that. This may not really, but I do, yeah. I mean, I think I probably said it badly by saying that accepting this as a justice. It's more like coming to some idea of this is just and this isn't. Not everything goes. It's when you read Nietzsche, right? Like, he's a great psychotic philosopher, and you get a sense that he almost celebrates relations of force, right? The powerful, the strong. It's a simplification of Nietzsche, but it's very typical of the psychotic mind to reduce all human relation to relations of force. But this is you can't have a society based on that. Society needs something other than relations of force. I think there's yeah, go ahead.
Can I just pick up on that, because you're going to go on to the next section, I think in a few minutes. But while you're in this section, it's become quite clear what psychosis is. It's not clear yet in this section what neurosis is for me. Could you just sort of rehearse that, or will you come back to that?
I think I'll try to come to it. I'll try to come to it. Yeah. Good question. Yeah, I'll come to that. Yeah. Maybe I'll hear Gautam, I believe, has raised a hand. I believe, yes, is that right? Please go ahead. Gautam, did you have a question?
Yeah, am I audible? Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, sure, sir. I have a question from the sense of this child psychosis. Somewhere I read that childs generally they throw things and toys, and again they tries to get it back. Is there any psychosis in the child's psychology, or how do you like this, sir?
A child who's behaving aggressively, you mean? Is that what I?
Yeah, maybe aggressively, and then again he wants to get it back. He or she.
Get what back?
he or she wants to get it back. And this is something, is there any psychosexual relationship or psychosexual background behind this kind of behavior? And is there any familiarizing with the society, the kind of social reality, the gain and loss of the society, all these?
I don't know what you mean. You said that the child wants to get it back. I think I missed what you mean by it.
Coise.
Oh, okay. It's very hard to define a psychotic structure on the basis of one type of behavior. You know, a person's structure, psychotic, neurotic, or perverse, will take up to about the age of 6 or 7 to be established. Up until then, there's enough plasticity to go either way. And it's really a question, I mean, to go back to the question that was raised before, I believe that it was asked, like, okay, so we understood a bit what psychosis is, but what is neurosis? And in a sense, that what I would say is a neurotic structure is one where, according to this interpersonal schema that you put here, is a neurotic structure is one where there is the recognition that, you know, one is not the center of the mother's world, and that this has something to do with the fact that her interest is elsewhere, and a certain internalization of authority occurs. But, and I think this is the important point, maybe I've said it a bit unclearly, that internalization of authority allows the neurotic subject in turn to castrate the authority itself from any abuse of power. This is the important point of the neurotic. The psychotic who lives in a situation of a rejecting of that authority is paradoxically not freer than the neurotic, but is actually more at the mercy, because not having internalized authority, they themselves cannot find within themselves the power to castrate the other as well. So this is kind of, in a sense, now in terms of the behavior of a child with toys or whatever, it's hard to say, because what needs to happen is something by the age of 6 or 7, where some experience of, and Lacan calls it the name of the father, which is his way of speaking about this internalization of authority, this act of faith by which the child agrees to the losses that we just named, and in return gains many things, gains the ability to enjoy.
That's it. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Probably should I continue with the next part? Yeah. Okay. I'll continue with the next part. So I'll go on to the language part. Now, the advantage of thinking about it in terms of language as well is that all of this sort of thinking too much in terms of people and protagonists, etc., opens up. And this is, I think, very, very crucial today, where the family structure is changing so much. It's no longer necessarily a mother and a father, and it's no longer in such clearly defined roles as maybe early psychoanalysis kind of had it, which might look a little bit caricatural to our eyes now, where we see a radical reconfiguration of the family structure, and maybe even a dissolution of the family structure in some cases. And at any rate, a rewriting of the roles of mother and father. So in this second section, I call it language. The word is the death of the thing. And again, we have a reference to a loss, a death. And here's one that happens through language, symbolic death again, but it's no longer conceptualized so much as in the case before, through the symbolic death of the father or the child, or the loss of being, or the narcissistic blow, or the loss of being the object of the mother, etc. It's thought of as in a different way. And this, as I said, has the advantage of not putting so much emphasis on the empirical situation of the family, because it's always very, very hazy. You can have a situation where you would think, and that's why within a family, you might have like 3 or 4 kids, and 1 or 2 may be psychotic, and The other two may be neurotic, and they have the same parents essentially. So one has to kind of, allow for a lot of gray zone. And this switch to a more linguistic model allows for that. It allows for one to think less empirically about it. That said, doesn't mean that one shouldn't think in the interpersonal model. This is just to add something to it, to that sort of perspective. So when we go back to the primal father story, what we see is, to recast it now in a linguistic model, we could say that after the murder, when the brothers realize that, oh, the enjoyment they were looking for is impossible, what happens is the father is raised to the status or level of a symbol. This is very, very crucial. We have to here make a distinction, a kind of central distinction, I would say, for psychoanalysis, between a symbol and an idol. And this goes back to what was said earlier about dictators and leaders and different types of leaders. Leaders that want to usurp all power and enjoyment for themselves, and leaders who submit themselves somewhat to law as well, or entirely submit themselves to law. This is the difference between a symbol and an idol. A symbol marks the absence of something, forbids filling it in, and recognizes that filling it in can be disastrous. An idol, on the other hand, attempts to fill in something. So the primal father, the father prior to the murder, was an idol, an entity that was all enjoying, all powerful, etc., led to the false belief for the brothers that if they kill him, they themselves could take on that kind of position. After the murder, they realized wisely that that enjoyment is an impossible enjoyment and a dangerous one, but also impossible. So instead of re-erecting a new idol, they create the father as a symbol, meaning a tablet of laws and perhaps an individual that represents those laws, but an individual that is there as the leader and representative of a set of laws beyond him or herself is very different than an individual who is the law himself or herself. This is the difference between a symbol and an idol. An idol, a symbol is in the place of something. An idol is the thing itself. You can kind of think of it between a symbol and the thing it symbolized. There's a relationship possibly of contingency, or maybe a small kind of link. But an idol is the thing itself. So the father before the murder, the primal father, is the law. He's not there to represent a law that is superior than himself. He is himself the law. The father after that murder, whatever father comes about, is a father that represents a table of laws that has already been written and just needs a representative and somebody to guarantee it. So the primal father is an idol. The symbolic father is a symbol. This is a very fundamental distinction, which we can look at in this kind of linguistic way. What happens in the Oedipal story is that once the father intervenes and his intervention is accepted by the child, paradoxically, even though the father comes later in chronological time, according to Freud and Lacan, the father is kind of elevated to the status of a first signifier. This is Lacan's words. This means that the child's psyche is reconfigured with the idea and notion of the father as symbol, the symbolic father, as opposed to the idol father, as central. And that creates the neurotic structure. The neurotic structure gets created when the idol father is replaced by the symbolic father, when an idol takes the place of, is replaced by a symbol. And this goes hand in hand with what I spoke about earlier as a sort of act of faith.
Sorry, could you repeat that one more time right there, please? I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
I didn't follow that sentence very well.
Okay, sure. So what happens is that when the father intervenes in the Oedipal situation, though his intervention chronologically comes after that of the mother, if his intervention occurs, and if the intervention occurs both in its dimension of interdiction and promise, which I will talk about in a second, if both of those interventions of the father are internalized, that creates a radical reconfiguring of the child's psyche. Even though the father comes later, it creates a radical reconfiguring of the child's psyche in terms of, in such a way that the idea of a symbol takes precedence over that of idol. In other words, it means that the idea of the rule of law takes precedence over that of the rule of force. That's another way of saying it. That absence takes precedence over presence. Symbol takes precedence over the thing itself. This is what the father's intervention, if it occurs, if space for it is made by the mother and the child is able to internalize it, we have the creation of a neurotic structure where everything that the child has up until then experienced is reconfigured in terms of what Lacan calls the elevation of the father to the status of a first signifier, which I'm going to translate to say that all of a sudden, the psyche of the child is configured in such a way that the idea of a symbol of the rule of law takes primacy over that of idol or the rule of force. So a subject that decides to get an education because that's what's going to help them find a job, as opposed to a child that decides to become a gangster because that gives the most power. And, you know, if you don't have power, you're not safe. I'm putting it caricaturally, but that's the difference between a symbol and an idol. A gangster is an idol. He or she, a gangster is not there to represent a law above it himself. He is the law himself. Well, whatever the whim of the moment is, that's the law. But a leader of a social institution where the symbol has primacy over the idol, such a leader as symbol rather than idol places the law that he or she represents as above him or herself. That's the restructuring of the psyche that occurs in neurosis, where all of a sudden symbol takes primacy over idol. Now, this intervention of the father, I said, has two essential aspects. One is an aspect of an interdiction, a prohibition, but another one is that, and this is the one that I'm bringing about again, is that of what Lacan calls metaphor. Again, we're in the realm of language. Now, in Seminar 5, Lacan defines a metaphor, and he has a very bizarre definition of it, but he defines metaphor as something, the meaning of which comes to fruition later on. This is very important for Lacan. A metaphor is a promise of a future meaning. This is why I have tied it to the idea of faith, because faith means generally faith in something that will come later, that it isn't there now, you know. And, you know, our credit system is based on faith. Credit comes from the Latin credere, which means to believe. Credit means I'm lending you money because I believe, I have faith in your power to pay it back with interest. You borrow money because you have faith in the power that you can pay it back with interest. That's an example of faith or belief. faith. We believe that if we're good today, we'll go to heaven tomorrow or whatever. So here, the idea of faith is extremely important. So Lacan talks about the father as a metaphor, because the father's intervention, and there's different ways in which the father is a metaphor, but I'm here now just talking about this aspect of a promise of something later. The father's intervention is intended to have the following effect. You give up something now, you get something later. What do you give up now? Being the object of the mother's desire. So you give up the narcissistic satisfaction of being the object of the mother's desire. And what do you get later? Adult sexual power, as a woman or as a man. You are able to ascend to adult sexuality, something that is very, very difficult for the psychotic child who remains the object of the mother's desire or enjoyment. Also promised to the child is a place in the social bond. You lose something of a privilege in relation to your mother, but you gain something in relation to society. You gain a singular and unique identity. Having a singular and unique identity is extremely important for humans. We are this bizarre animal that, despite the evidence to the contrary, the incredible evidence to the contrary, in a sense, we really, really believe we are extremely unique. In a sense, we are unique, each and every one of us, but at the same time, we're just one creature in this vast universe. But for humans, it's extremely important to have this belief in one's singularity. So much that if one loses the sense in one's singularity, it can lead to a suicidal feeling. By giving up being the object of the mother's enjoyment, the father also promises that you will become yourself someone with a desire rather than serving someone else's desire. So you will be unique, singular, have a place in the social bond, ascend to adult sexuality, and have a desire that singularizes you, and you might be able to achieve peaceful social coexistence and find a feeling of being lovable within the greater social situation. These are all the promises of the paternal metaphor. But there's another way in which, and it's all tied together, that the father is a metaphor for Lacan, because a metaphor is also something that substitutes something else. So when we say the sea is a wild dog, or I don't know, whatever, we're substituting a certain aspect of the sea for a certain aspect of a wild dog. And the father precisely does that, because for Lacan, the intervention of the father brings about a substitution whereby the desire of the mother is replaced by the name of the father. What happens is that the child, when he or she interprets that the mother is sometimes not there, is not left with this perplexing question forever. What is the desire of the mother? What is the desire of the mother? But can replace the desire of the mother with some sense that, oh, there is something to do with father. And so the question, the perplexing, enigmatic question of the desire of the mother, that particular form of desire that she keeps censored from the children, that the children cannot satisfy, but that she needs some adult person, and that weird, perplexing question, okay, it has something to do with father. This is another way in which fathers, he talks about it as a paternal metaphor. It allows the child to be able to make some sense that is no longer perplexing and persecutory for why it is that the mother sometimes seems like she'd rather be somewhere else. Now, with all of this, there's the question of the name. Lacan calls this the name of the father, right? And in French, name and know are homonymous. Le nom du père, N-O-N, the know of the father, and the name of the father, N-O-M, the name of the father. And these are very interrelated. They represent these two sides of the father's intervention. On the one side, a restriction, but on the other side, giving the child a name. And the accepting of the paternal name is kind of the insignia of that central act of faith that I have said occurs within neurosis. Sometimes one sees that in psychotic individuals, there is a literal rejection of the father's name. That's not always the case, but you see it like in Van Gogh's paintings. So Van Gogh is a psychotic. And if you look at his paintings, they're always signed Vincent. There's never a painting with Van Gogh written on it, at least as far as I know. It's always Vincent. Van Gogh is Vincent. He radically rejects belonging to the lineage of the Van Goghs. He is a Vincent. He belongs to the lineage. He creates a different lineage for himself, a lineage that is independent of the family lineage. For him, he's the child of Rembrandt, another Dutch painter, perhaps, or Jan Vermeer, or I don't know exactly who he saw himself, but he's not the son of Mr. Van and Mrs. Van Gogh. He belongs to a different lineage, and it's very, very interesting in his case that it's almost signaled by the fact that if you look at his paintings, it says Vincent, not Vincent van Gogh. So the first name, a child's first name, symbolizes at an unconscious level, our first name symbolizes for us the enjoyment that our parents have of us because they chose that name for us. That name that they chose for us is an index of the fantasies they had. So if, parents decide to name their child Napoleon, it gives you an idea of what they're expecting their child to do. Or if they name their child, like in Farsi, in Iranian, a lot of names have actual meanings. They're not just names, like there'll be names of flowers, let's say, or names of victory or prosperity or hope, or a lot of names have. So it's easier sometimes to decipher what the parental fantasy is. So the first name is very rich in the parental fantasy and in the incestuous desire of the parents for that child. The patronymic, the last name, on the other hand, is quite different because that's sort of decided in advance. That's not really chosen by the parents. And for the child to get to it, to get to the point where he can really accept the patronymic as his or her own, really internalize it in a way that, let's say, Vincent van Gogh didn't, there is a certain process of overcoming the incestuous meaning of the first name. So it's clinically, what does all this mean? Clinically, when patient comes in, they give you their name, their last name, and so on. And, some people ask right away. I don't generally ask right away, but if over time I kind of get a sense and I say, do you know how you came to have this name? It's very interesting. People will have a lot to say about how and why they have the name they do. And it gives you a certain idea of the fantasy of the parents in giving them that name and their own fantasy in accepting that name. And sometimes it can be quite symptomatic for some people, and sometimes not necessarily. But the internalization and integration of the last name is sort of concomitant with what at the interpersonal level we said is a kind of internalization of parental authority, which is a way of at once partially submitting to an authority, but also overcoming that authority. And that's the dialectic. Only he or she who internalizes authority can then be powerful enough to overcome it. And that is seen in this relationship between the transition from the first name to the surname. This is, sometimes what one sees in people for whom the first name is too imbued with incestuous meaning is sometimes they have trouble just even introducing themselves in a public situation and saying, hi, I'm so-and-so. And, colloquially, it's understood, oh, maybe this person lacks self-confidence, etc. But what could be really going on is saying their own name re-evokes all the incestuous meaning that hearing their mother or their father say their name throughout their life brought for them. And maybe the parents put in too much enjoyment in saying their name, that now every time they say their own name and present it, and this can happen in neurosis or psychosis, this awkwardness of saying one's name. In psychosis, what one sees sometimes is identity amnesia, where a person forgets absolutely who they were and forgets their own name. It's a very remarkable thing, a person forgetting their own name forever. And what is actually happening there in that amnesia is a protection against incest. It's a way of forgetting the fantasy and desire of those who named you, namely the parents. So if the name is too eroticized, it can have almost the signification of a rape or the signification of a marriage. And sometimes, especially in the case of psychosis, where this can be very extreme, the defense mechanism is an identity amnesia. And sometimes identity amnesias, as I said, can last the rest of a life. Assuming one's name, the surname, assuming it, just as I said, is concomitant with the assumption of authority. Assuming authority, internalizing it is at the same time subverting it. It's the child who says, okay, I'll sleep at 7:30, whatever, but, you also have to remember not to make too much noise while I'm asleep. That child will be able to respond to the parent with a bit of a reasonable lawmaking, maybe of his or her own. And this, at the level of the name, happens when the child is able to internalize the surname, which is a name that is less imbued with the incestuous meaning of the first name. And it's a way, kind of like the parasital fantasy I spoke about earlier, which puts an end to the incestuous rapport. The accepting of the surname can be, symbolic of this parasital act by which, a certain incestuous relation is mitigated. For Lacan, it's very, very important. All of these things that I said about psychosis and, these relations of force not being able to give way to relations regulated by law, where the idol doesn't give way to the symbol, all of these things where, the primal father doesn't give way to the symbolic father, where the incest taboo is not properly put in place. All of that for Lacan entails a very, very damaged relationship to language. For Lacan, all of this is really fundamentally about language. So when the incest taboo is not properly internalized and the difference between generations is not properly understood, what we see is not just a problematic relation to social others in the world for the psychotic, but we see a problematic relationship with language. This was one of the brilliant discoveries of Lacan, to realize that what is really at stake, as well as the interpersonal relations, is something of the level of a subject's relationship to language. And this is what we see often in psychoses and in autism particularly, are subjects who try to create new languages. James Joyce wrote Finnegan's Wake in a language that he invented, which is a mix of 40 different languages. In this language that is completely novel. You see it, very often in autism, autistic subjects who like to invent languages. They learn a lot about the way languages work, and then they sit and create a language of their own. They're trying to repair a flaw in language. Just like the family situation, the situation of the family institution was flawed for them, in that authority didn't function in the symbolic way, but functioned more in the idyllic way, as an idol. Just like relations of force weren't substituted by relations of law, just like authority wasn't there as a kind of dialectical unity of force and love, we see all of this is reflected in a experience of language as something radically flawed and erroneous for them. And so what do they try to do? Some of them is fix that. And the attempt to fix that is extremely healing and curative for the psychotic subject, and hence should not only be but it should be encouraged, basically. And I see this clinically very often. This kind of attempt to correct the flaw of language. We saw that with James Joyce. There's an example in a famous person, but it does exist elsewhere as well. Now, a few more things. Go ahead.
Sorry, because I wasn't sure if you.
Yep.
I wasn't sure if you misspoke or if you chose the word you wanted, because you were talking about an autistic person, and then you spoke about a psychotic person. So I was just wondering, is it the psychotic person who tries to fix that messiness and is related to, he becomes an autistic person, or what's the relation between the psychotic who tries to fix it and the autistic person? I wasn't sure of the connection.
Yeah, no, a great question. So autism and psychosis, from the Lacanian perspective, fall under the side of foreclosure, meaning of structures that are non-neurotic. There is a difference between autism and psychosis, for sure, but psychosis is also not a univocal entity. Psychosis involves schizophrenia, paranoia, melancholia, manic-depressive, etc. But all of these categories, paranoia, schizophrenia, manic-depressive, psychosis, melancholia, autism, etc., all of them share in that everything that I've just said that occurs in neurosis, something else happens there. So we don't get this replacement of... Exactly. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it doesn't happen. And so hence there is this experience of something faulty that they're trying to repair, autism or paranoia or whatever. Now, you see this case by case in a different way. Psychotic subject might come in and say, the problem is capitalism. I'm going to fix it. Another one might say, the problem is the monarchy. I'm going to topple it down, whatever, right? And another person, autistic, psychotic, paranoid, whatever, might say, the problem is, I don't know, a certain racial group. I'm going to exterminate them or something like that. That's obviously a very, very dangerous category, but of course, we know that historically it's existed. Another person might come and say, the problem is the foundation of modern physics is flawed. I'm going to find a better way. There's some other that one sees in psycho where there's an experience that there's some flaw in it and it has to be rectified. And there's incredible effort to single-handedly fix this. And, sometimes it leads to incredible achievements, in terms of incredible human capacity, and sometimes perhaps it doesn't. Obviously, most of the time it doesn't have world historical significance. What one sees in melancholia as a very special case is that they do notice a flaw, but the flaw is themselves, and that's why the risk of suicide is so high. Melancholics often feel that if they die, the world will be a better place because they feel like they are so polluted in sin and so on. So, yeah.
And the neurotic tries to repair too, or
no. The neurotic, the experience in neurosis that we just explained, the world for the neurotic is good enough. It's not great. There's room for repair, etc., but it's good enough. And that's why often what one sees is neurotic. This is one of the markers of a difference between when you have a neurotic patient clinically. A neurotic comes in and talks about mommy and daddy, generally, or a husband and wife, or their children. Psychotics come in and they talk about these grand matters. It's like ever since the Renaissance, humanity has been on this wrong path, and like read Nietzsche. He's not tackling a small little problem. Look, he thinks Western civilization is corrupt in its two fundamental pillars, which are Christ and Socrates, and that this needs rectification, otherwise we're doomed. You look at Jean-Jacques Rousseau, his work is really to sort of show the corruption within the society that he lives. James Joyce, we need a new language. English, it's not good enough for what I'm trying to say. There's this incredible need to correct something. You don't see that in this way in neurosis. A neurotic who can be a very intelligent man or woman can think, okay, yeah, capitalism is a problem. I'm gonna join, I don't know, a communist party, but there's no sense that they have a saintly role to single-handedly fix this. And there isn't generally this incredible will to die doing it. And that's what you see in psychosis. There's this at any cost, and it could be a good cause that they're doing, or it could be totally evil as well, where they see the flaw in a group of innocent people that they're trying to get rid of or whatever. But this is something that you see, and it's what Lacan shows is that, and this is kind of what I'm getting to, is that there is this fundamental flaw in the way even language works for them. It's not just the interpersonal relations in the family situation that is flawed, but there is this flaw in the way language works. I can quickly say a couple of more words about it. I think we should end. Maybe I'll try to wrap it up in the next 10 minutes just to say a few last things, because I think you may find it interesting. I'll try to keep it in 10 minutes and then we'll go on to questions. And I'd love to hear more questions for sure. So one, and I'll try to be very brief and skim through some of this, but one thing that Lacan distinguishes is the sign, the trace, and the signifier. A sign has a very immediate relation to what it's a sign of. So maybe for certain animals, seeing puffed up red lips on the face of someone of the opposite sex means sexual attraction, and then they're all of a sudden aroused and they have sex. The red lips and the sexual attraction are intimately linked together. They belong together. It's not some contingent symbol, right? It's not like the red lip is part of it, and that's a sign. A sign is kind of like a symbol that is absolutely tied. And you see that a lot in the animal kingdom. The natural world, let's say, is full of signs, right? It's an instinctive form of communication, but it doesn't characterize the way human languages work. The trace, on the other hand, if you see a footprint, etc., it's also tied to the object, like this footprint belongs to this type of animal, etc. But a certain loss is already found in a trace, because a trace means that the thing that it's a trace of is no longer there. So there's already a little bit of a loss. Now, a signifier is even further. So imagine if this is Lacan's example. You're walking in a forest and you see like a footstep of a certain type of gorilla, and you can tell. So there's that little element of loss because the gorilla is no longer there. There's just a trace. Now imagine you wipe away the trace and you put in a flag there, right? To remember that here there was a footprint of a gorilla. That becomes a signifier. It's doubly removed. It's even further, and the absence is doubly signified, and the flag has no relationship to the foot of that gorilla. It's just a flag. I could have put, instead of a flag, a tire, a baseball, or bat, or a helmet, or whatever. My glasses, it doesn't matter. But I chose a flag. In this particular case, it's absolutely contingently related. This is what the realm of human language is about, is words that are contingently related to some meanings, but for human languages, and this is a very, very important fact for Lacan, words get their signification not from their relation to the thing that they are referred to, like banana refers to this fruit, but by their relation to other words. So the word banana gets its meaning not by its relation to some fruit called banana, but by its differential relation to orange and grape and apple, etc. So language becomes almost entirely separate from the realm of reference. This is how signifiers work, and this is how human language works. Human language becomes almost entirely separate from the realm of things that it designates. That's why with humans, we can just enjoy speaking, and we don't use language simply to refer to things in the external world. Language just refers to itself, just like in a dictionary. You look up a word, in the definition, there's a word you don't know, you look up another, and the dictionary just kind of has you spiral within itself. Language becomes kind of separate. That's how human languages generally work. What we see in autism, particularly this particular clinical category in autism that we see, is that language really stays at the level of sign. For the autistic person, the ambiguities of a language made up of signifiers is very, very hard to bear. They really need words to really mean that. And that's why autistic people often find it very interesting to create languages, because as they're doing it, they're fully in control of all the ambiguities of that language. Like, okay, today I'm going to create 10 words related to this aspect of life. Tomorrow I'm going to create these verbs, then these grammatical rules, then this, then that. And that can be extremely curative for them. But their relation of language to the external world is one that is very rigid. It's very much like a sign language. And that's why ambiguities are very difficult for them to bear. And even ambiguities in scheduling, things have to be very predictable. And that has precisely to do that need for rhythms and schedules that are very strict in autism is precisely because of this particular experience of language that they have, which is more at the level of sign than at the level of signifier. This is, one of the things that we see for the comfort and ease at dealing with all the ambiguities and the possible misunderstandings that language can bring about when language becomes a system of signifiers. For that to take place, a neurotic structure makes that very available. And so that the ambiguities of language are not persecutory. And that's why it's very important if working with psychotic person, paranoid, schizophrenic, autistic, etc., not to use too much equivocation, not to sound too enigmatic. With neurotics, maybe one can do that, create enigmas to see what kind of psychic effects that can create and what it can help the subject produce. But in the psychoses or of various types in autism, etc., it's better to avoid that, because the experience of language as a system of signifiers is very troubling sometimes for them. And that's what they're trying to rectify with these inventions of new languages, etc. Lastly, and I'll just I just want to say a few things about topology, which is the last section of the talk. And that's the section that I call the creation of a true whole. So what we saw with signifiers is that it's a double inscription of loss. It's further separated from the thing itself. Just like in the interpersonal, we saw that it's a system of losses, one after the other, that leads to neurosis. What we see with language is that it's a system of losses and separations from the thing itself that leads to the neurotic relationship with language. What we see with topology is in order to have a neurotic structure, you need, or a stable psychotic structure, because in psychosis you can have stable or unstable psychosis, you need the creation of what we call a true whole as opposed to a fake whole. And for that, I will show you something of a picture to give you the idea of a of the difference between a true whole and a not true whole. So, okay, no, not this. Okay, let's see. Okay, how do I screen share again? I go at the arrow at the bottom, right? Correct?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So, okay. Okay. All right. What do I do? I just press that arrow, that's it?
Select your screen, the one you want to share.
What do I do?
Select the screen that you want to share after clicking on.
Yeah, I've selected it.
Okay.
Mhm.
Now share it.
Okay. Okay, there we go. Do you see what do you see? Do you see these three rings?
Yes.
Okay, great. So if you look at the rings, okay, just ignore all the letters and those the written stuff. You see blue, green, and red. Blue, green, and red. Now, take any two of them at a given point. So let's just look at the blue and the green, okay? They're not attached to each other. The blue and the green are not attached. The blue is on top, right? Now, look at the red and the blue. Just the red and the blue, ignore the green. They are also not attached. Now, look at the red and the green. They are also not attached. But when all three are considered together, they're totally attached, okay? And look at the middle. The middle constitutes what we call a true whole, because if you try to bring the if you try to separate them, like spread them apart from each other, that hole in the middle will always stay. The only way you can get rid of that hole in the middle is if you take a scissor and cut one of these rings, right? That hole in the middle will always be there. That hole is symbolic of all those losses that we spoke about, the losses that bring about the proper functioning of language, or the losses that bring about peaceful social coexistence. And this is topologically represented in the creation of a true whole there. Okay, so now I'll show you a case here of, so I'll stop the share, and I'll show you a case of a whole that isn't a true whole. Okay, there. Okay. Do you see this new picture that has this extra little black circle as well? So that one, ignore the black circle for now, ignore it, and just look at the three rings. If you look at the red and the blue, just look at the red and the blue. Are they connected? You can see that they are. They're actually connected like this, unlike in the previous one. Now ignore the black one again and look at the green. If you look at the green one, it's not connected to anything. If the black one wasn't there, it would just slip out, right? So it's falsely connected to the other two, and the other two are connected to the other to each other. So in the previous rings, that was what we call a Borromean knot, which exemplifies neurotic structure. The three rings are connected to each other without any two being connected to each other, and there's no way you can obliterate the hole in the middle. But here, if you take out that black ring, if you take it out, you see there is no hole. There's absolutely no hole. It looks like there's a hole between the three, but all you have to do is pull out the green one and the hole disappears. So it's a fake hole. So that would be an exemplification of madness, when the hole disappears, where you live in a world that's totally full with the idol. The symbol, the symbolic father, the signifier always creates the space of negation that is extremely important for sanity. So if we just take the green, red, and blue circles, we see that the hole that's there in the middle is totally fake. It's not really a hole. So what's the purpose of the black hole? The black hole is what Lacan calls the symptôme. It's the effort that the psychotic subject can do, with success in this case, to create an extra ring so that the green thing can't fly away and the hole becomes a true hole. Now you actually have a hole in the middle that cannot be, you can't just take any one of these and pull them off and ruin the hole. So what we see is three possibilities: a Borromean knot with a hole in the middle, like the first one that I showed you, that's a neurotic structure, or this without the extra black, right, becomes a fake hole, which is madness, right? That becomes a psychotic who is at the mercy of madness. Or you can have, within psychosis, a very personal effort on the part of the psychotic or the autistic subject to invent a new language or to be politically active or to do something that is corrective of a problem that they see. And through that effort, they create this extra fourth ring that enables the guaranteeing that a true whole can persist. And so that's how these negations kind of that I've been talking about as conditions of sanity, regardless of the structure, kind of happen at the level of the symbolic father taking the place of the father as idol, at the level of the signifier taking the place of the sign, or the symbol taking the place of the idol, and at the part where the true whole takes precedence over the fake whole. And that's the last topological part. And I think at this point, I can open the floor to questions if there are any. Yes, I believe Daniel has a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was an amazing talk. When I was reading the lectures, I came across a point where Lacan contrasts Freud's approximation with Jung's approximation, with Freud more on the language side and Jung more on the creative image side of analysis. Can you tell us a bit more about the difference in their approaches?
Jung and Lacan?
And a bit more with his position towards Jung's analysis of the image.
Yeah, I'm gonna try. I'm not very familiar with Jung. I know barely even Jung for dummies. So like, please correct me if I say something that it creates a straw man, because I may be wrong. But I think that in a nutshell, what you one of the differences between Jung and Lacan, I think, or Freud, is that Jung believes in universal symbols, right? And I think that the problem with universal symbols is that they have a tendency to become idols. It's very, very important, especially, let's say, the universal symbols of masculinity and femininity, etc. What mondialization, if you will, or globalization, or the clash of civilizations, or however you want to put it, has shown us is that no cultures, fictions, or inventions are of absolute truth. Every culture creates for itself symbols, images, idols, symbols, all sorts of different things as fictions with which it can live. What the contemporary clash of civilizations has made it clear to some is that, what I thought are the absolute truths of my culture are just the contingent truths of the specific situation I'm in. And the way I sort of see the Jungian tendency, and Jordan Peterson is a Jungian, and I think that one of the difficulties I personally have with his view is that he's trying to reestablish a certain universal type of imago. It's like men are this way. You see Jordan Peterson often say this, men prefer things and women prefer people. And there's all these different types of very rigid categorizations. I think, but I'm not sure, and it's because I'm ignorant of Jung, and I know Jung is an incredible mind. The bits I've read of him, obviously he is a very insightful person. But I do think that by contrast to the Lacanian approach, there is a tendency towards the creation of idols rather than symbols, and in which case I do feel like the trueness of the whole, to put it topologically, is more precarious within the Jungian picture.
The Jungian picture is close to the Jasper's relation of comprehension, or comprehension relation.
I don't know enough about it. I don't know. I also know only very little about Jasper's, even less. And unfortunately, I wouldn't be able to answer in any learned way about it. I don't want to say. it's you know, it was a bit off the cuff, my response. So
it was some of the things that I noted when doing the lecture, doing the reading.
Yeah, no, I'm yeah, thanks. I don't know that much about Jung's well, Jasper's even less, but you know, so my personal view, you know, of Jung is, you know, the idea of universal symbols. To me, a universal symbol is kind of not a symbol. It's an idol, but by virtue of this universality, it becomes there's a question, do you have a personal opinion about whether schizophrenia and autism are equated? Okay, but of course, at one point he held this belief, but in a later stage, it appears that he refutes it based on the influence. Okay. Yeah, I mean, the work the work done by Lacanians regarding autism, it's contemporary work. There's been a great book recently written by Leon Brenner, The Autistic Subject on the Threshold of Language. Jean-Claude Malval has done a lot of work. Éric Laurent has done a lot of work. These are the contemporary Lacanians. There's a lot of question on, you know, traditionally autism was grouped with the psychoses. Now it's seen as somewhat distinct, as involving a more radical foreclosure. But at the same time, schizophrenia is very distinct from paranoia too. So, you know, and schizophrenia involves a more radical foreclosure. So these are all very open questions. They're being talked about right now. There's a question about ordinary psychosis. Ordinary psychosis is a very interesting category. That last picture that I showed is an exemplification of ordinary psychosis. It's a kind of knotting of the three registers of real, imaginary, symbolic that is not Borromean. Borromean specifically means a kind of knotting where no two rings are knotted together, but all three are somehow knotted together. That's the specific neurotic Borromean ring. But what Lacan showed is that people can have a non-Borromean way of creating a true whole between those three. And that particular picture I showed is the way he showed, James Joyce did it, with the black ring symbolizing his artistic creative work and his sense of importance in history as one of the great writers. So this, I think, is, you know, how we understand ordinary psychosis. So now the question is, how do we understand that a subject doesn't have a Borromean structure? Well, you can see it in different ways. There are indicators of different types, the type of complaints people have, the relationship with language, with law, with love, with their body, all of these things, which, you know, I won't have to get into all the detail now, give us an idea that, oh, okay, this person is sane, they're functioning very well, meaning that there is the institution of the symbol having primacy over the idol. There is the creation of a true whole within a non-Borromean structure, but they don't have a neurotic structure. And this is why Lacan was great in making us see that psychosis doesn't mean something bad. It just means that at the end of his work, that became very, very clear. It just means that it's a non-Borromean way of creating a whole within the structure. And if a whole can be created, it doesn't matter if it's Borromean or not. As long as there's a whole, there is sanity. And the person can live, have a sense of life, of meaning, of purpose, of, you know, desire, etc.
I'm sorry. Yeah, non-Borromean way to create whole, yes, but it means that it is these notes are not strictly. For example, Borromean way, they cannot be divided, but in ordinary psychosis, non-Borromean way, to make the whole, it means that it can be in one way divided.
Yeah, I think that's the difference exactly, is that it's a question that if you stretch the rings apart, will the whole stay or it's going to fall apart? And in the first picture, it's going nowhere. It's very rigid. Neurotics are very, very flexible. If you have a neurotic patient and you make a bad interpretation and they get offended, they can forgive you. Say, okay, whatever. If you make an interpretation with somebody who's not Borromean and it's really bad, you can drive them crazy if there's no non-Borromean. But what we saw, if the black circle isn't there, that's extremely dangerous, right? Because what you see is a completely fake hole. Two rings are attached to each other, but they make no hole. They're just, there's no hole. And the third one that is slipped in there is just fake. It looks like it's created a hole, but you can just slip it off, right? And so what you see, and this is what you have to help them do. If they tell you, oh, I'm inventing a new language, don't say, what is this nonsense? You should instead go make money or something like that, because this is very important for them. They're making a language, right? And so that's going to help them. I see it quite frequently, people with these very unique endeavors that have the value of a fourth ring that helps them create the whole. Whenever the whole, whenever a subject feels that the whole is gone, they want to commit suicide. Life without a whole is no life at all. And that's what happens. Sometimes, you see that often with psychotic patients or autistic patients it can happen in neurosis too. All of a sudden, they need to call the suicide hotline right away. And they often don't even know why. Because of this flaw in language, they cannot associate what causes the suffering to the suffering. So, when a neurotic says, I'm depressed, you say, why? And he says, I don't know, I lost money or whatever. He has some, but, you get subjects who come and say, I'm depressed, I can't do it. And it's deep and they have no idea why, because language doesn't work enough, and so they create their own language and they do all of this. And then slowly they're able to voice their emotions, maybe through this other language. They like this other language that they've invented because it helps them express something that English doesn't have, or whatever. And all of a sudden, there's a hole. And the more they can advance in the creating of that fourth ring, the more likely that they're not gonna. But it's still very fragile in comparison to the neurotic Borromean link. There's these moments where they really feel, despair, right? But it helps them a lot. And in some cases of autism, the fourth ring is so good that it's invisible to the expert that this person is autistic or psychotic. Yes, I believe Matthew Raymond has a question.
Yeah, thanks. So I just wanted to touch on the construction of this fourth ring and how you see it in relation to the question of negation, which is so important in stabilizing the neurotic structure, is accepting that the social, being a part of the social bond requires the limitations of negation. Does it play the same function in the
I think
psychotic?
So. I think so, completely. Great question. I think it's a way of instantiating negation through a very personal means, through one that works for them. The rest of us, whoever the rest of us are, we kind of do it through this paternal question, right? That's the whole that we create, or we belong to a kind of universality of the paternal whole, let's say, or something like that. But here, the whole might be very personal, a way of instantiating a negation. So instead of creating a whole by murdering people is the way. So you see sometimes in autism, massive bouts of violence. Right? The bout of violence, the creating holes, punching into walls, etc., are ways of creating holes, right? But what you see is, okay, instead of doing that, I'm going to write a book, fiction, about a guy who does that. It's a negation, right? It's a postponing of, it involves sublimation. It involves creating a name for oneself within a community of artists, or I don't know, whatever, or writers, or however one wants to conceptualize it. But you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, the fourth ring, what stabilizes, its power of stabilization will depend entirely on how well it can create that negation. So if somebody's stabilizing themselves by doing crack, that can stabilize somebody, because they can be so full of like incredible emotion that only cocaine or crack or heroin or whatever can help them. That's not going to be that good of a stabilization. It can kill them eventually. It's going to cause problem, whatever. It's not, but sometimes that's all a person has at their disposal. Sometimes a person does that and still, but James Joyce, it's not like, through writing everything was fine. He was extremely alcoholic. He had a lot of problems. It wasn't that everything was hunky dory. I recently found out that Johann Sebastian Bach was an extremely violent young man, and that he was drinking like copious amounts of beer. That the Germans apparently still have the beer sellers. There are still records of how much beer he would buy. It's possible. That for Bach too, all this writing, when you see an activity that is so extreme. If you were to, I heard that if you were to sit and make a 9-to-5 job of retranscribing Bach's works, it might take you 20 years of a 9-to-5 just to retranscribe what this guy created. You can see like that level of intensity. It does lead to the question, was he doing it not to go crazy, basically? He felt that it was a way of maintaining the whole. And, it's like what Michelangelo said, like he said, as a sculptor, you're just shaving off the excess, right? Like through sculpting, it's like he creates a whole. Or Mozart said the most important part of music is not the notes, but the silences in between, right? So in a sense, you can think that musical composition is a way of creating wholes. You're creating the whole between the music. It's like Heidegger's What is a Thing? If you've read that recently again, it's about how a thing really is a way of creating a whole. It was a paper that was very influential on Lacan. You see from the early work of Lacan, from the first seminar, he's talking a lot about vases and flower pots, and how do we create a whole, a pot in which we can put the things. What is it that we want to put in? Our emotions, our drives, our anxieties. If they can be put inside the whole, it's okay. If the whole falls apart and there's no whole, then it's not okay. And negation, you're absolutely right, is really, how do we create a vase, a whole? And it's almost not even an analogy. The topology for Lacan, it's the thing itself. It's really about, that's what people say. I need some space. Give me some headspace. I need a little room. Our language is full of spatial reference. I was going to say spatial metaphor, but it's not metaphor. It's really, it's the thing itself. Yeah. I believe Shaun has a question. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So within this very discussion, I'm thinking of a comment a very close friend made to me one time, and I don't know. I never knew how to think about it, but I'm thinking there might be tools here. But so if somebody said to you, if I didn't believe in progress, I would have to commit suicide. How would we break that down in these terms that you've put forward?
Great question. Progress means future, right? Progress means a belief and faith in the future. Because of the problem in being able to believe, what does life really requires? The category of faith. Even if you're an atheist, it requires believing that there is a tomorrow. I was told at the beginning of my clinical career by supervisors, if you feel like your patient is a psychotic, always say at the end of the session, I look forward to next week. So that there is this idea that time doesn't just end now. And the problem when the whole is very precarious, there is no whole, it means there is no future. The future is a whole, right? It's a whole that makes the present livable. Like, part of what makes the present livable is the idea that there is a future. And that's why I'm against all this live in the now kind of stuff. I mean, it's, as humans, we live in the past, but we also live in the idea of a future, and the hope and the idea that there is a future that is better, that exists, that makes today not utterly meaningless is extremely important, but it requires the existence of a whole. So when you tell a patient, I look forward to seeing you next week, you're creating a whole. You're creating that whole that joins this Wednesday to the following Wednesday. And all of a sudden, they have this whole. If you don't signal next Wednesday, you don't have a whole. You just have an infinite expanse, right? So progress, your friend says, if I couldn't believe in progress, it means if I couldn't believe in a tomorrow, he's right. Who can bear a life that doesn't have the idea of a tomorrow in it? But for those who have the chance to have a Borromean structure, those are given for most of the time. There is that. When you look at Heidegger's thinking, the structure of care, he talks about project and all these existentials of Dasein, that the fact that we care, we have a temporality, time, a relation to space, a relation to tomorrow, project, future, etc. All of those, rewritten in a Lacanian way, they are all the outcomes of a proper Borromean structure. Outside the Borromean structure, all of Heidegger's, the existentials of Heidegger become very precarious. There are subjects for whom tomorrow doesn't exist, the future, there is no such thing, who are completely fixated on a now that is very static and doesn't have the promise of progress or anything else. That's how I would see that. And I think it's, unfortunately, a sentence of that type that one often hears with people who suffer from mental illness is, there is no tomorrow, there is no... the whole, you could say, is like a minimum of a faith. I believe enough, that I won't kill myself today. I believe enough that something like that,
Let me be greedy, because this has major implications for me. So if someone, and here's a different example, I'm going to turn it. If someone asks a question of another person, what do they believe about something, and the answer is one that is rather contingent and does not allow the person who posed the question to identify the placement. And it causes a great deal of anxiety. Well, I need to know who you are. I need to know what you are. That kind of reaction, I never could understand such a reaction, but I saw it once. It didn't involve me, and I never knew how to think about that. But I found it quite awkward, and it reminds me of this discussion. Reminded me of it because of the promise that you refer to, and it has to be answered now. There can't be something unanswered, and this seemed to be very, very severe kind of response, that it had to be answered now, and the contingency was such a cause for anxiety. I don't know if that comes back to your discussion in the way that the way that I think it might.
Yeah, no, I think those are that type of anxiety. Anxiety for Lacan is the reaction humans have when they experience the disappearance of the whole. The lack of the lack, he calls it, causes anxiety. When the world is so full that there's no more place to breathe, no more place to move, no place to hide, like in a surveillance society, there's nowhere you can go that doesn't have a camera, something recording you, something looking at you, where something can just happen unseen and you can just forget about, when the world becomes so full that there is no lack anymore, there's a lack of the lack where the whole doesn't exist anymore, that brings anxiety. And anxiety does bring that type of very rigid questioning that you mentioned. I need to know. I can't deal with ambiguity. That's why, like, let's say clinically I go on holiday, need a couple of weeks off. About a month or a month and a half before I do so, I declare it to all my patients that, okay, in the middle of August, I'm going away for a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, whatever. Oh, why? Where are you going? You could just stay silent, see what does it bring to them, And I say, oh, where do you think I'm going? And they're like, no. But if somebody asks me in that way that you say, why I need to know, better just tell them, if it's that much anxiety. Because I'm going away triggers I'm not interesting enough for you. What's so much better than me? It brings all these infantile questions again. All the questions children ask, why is the sky blue? Why this? Why? It's not because children are naturally scientific. You often hear this cliche, like scientists often say, oh, children are scientists. When a child says, why is the sky blue? Why this? Why that? Why that? He or she is asking, why did you bring me to this world? What do you want of me? Do you love me? All these persistent questions. Why is this way? So these are all questions to see, is there a hole in the other in which I can have a place? And so when you go on holiday, then person asks, that's what they're saying. And if the asking is so, as you said, so anguished, so desperate, so scary, it's better to not leave an ambiguity and say, I'm just taking 3 weeks off. I'm going here, there, whatever. And if you need to be in touch, please call me. But otherwise, I'll see you in September. Again, create that, make sure that, you can keep the whole, right? Because otherwise, what happens with psychosis, because a question is a whole, and certainty is a way of filling in the hole, right? And so what you want sort of, you don't want to create too much enigma for a psychotic, because an enigma will open the space of fantasy, and in psychosis, the space of fantasy, if it opens, it doesn't close. That's the reason. In neurosis, it will close, particularly if you hear the fantasy and if you interpret it with them. But in psychosis, it's possible that the space of fantasy doesn't close. And when the space of fantasy doesn't close, eventually it leads more or less to death, either literal or subjective death of some sort, meaning like a very deep depression or something like that. Daniel?
Yeah, I was thinking about this whole and loss of the whole, and since I recently made an investigation on Lukács' work, I was thinking on his 1916 book, The Theory of the Novel, in which he depicts the novel as an attempt to reconstruct a fragmented totality which cannot be made. And Lukács identifies in the Greek epic an idealized notion of totality which has been lost and cannot be reconstructed. And the basic problems which Lukács identifies with the form of the novel as a literary method of expression is that the soul is either too small for the world or too big for the world to fit in it. And what you're saying makes me think that we could maybe make a psychoanalytic or Lacanian reading of the theory of the novel in relation to the loss of totality and the loss of a whole.
That's a great point. Yeah, why not? Yeah, that's a good PhD topic or a great book topic. Yeah, I'm again not that familiar with Lukács, but I'm sure it sounds like a promising avenue for research. Yeah. But I guess on that note, maybe we can call it a day. Thanks for listening and giving me a chance to test out the ideas for the book here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you very much.
Alireza.
Thank you, Sepideh. Thank you, Sepideh. Yeah, that was really fun for me and very useful. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.